Hey, you guys, I'm so excited you're here. Thank you for joining us for this session. You're rounding out our day.
Yes.
And so
We're thrilled.
I really appreciate you guys joining us. Andrea, thank you for joining us from Chicago. I hope it's nice up there today.
Not so much, but we're getting there. The weather is turning. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. And I will let you guys get started and see you in, a little bit. And then I'll help with Q&A too. We'll be managing that. And let us know if you have any questions in the Q&A window where your other participants can vote up and down on your question. And you can always send us a chat in the chat window.
Perfect. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you all so much for being here today. It is an incredible honor to share a topic that both Andrea and I are so passionate about. Andrea and I go way back. We've worked together. We got our PhDs at the same place. And she's actually been somebody that personally and professionally I've turned to, for this topic a lot, because even both of us being organizational psychologists, as you go through life, sometimes you wonder, am I experiencing these things? Is it okay? When do I, stay optimistic and just climb every mountain? And when do I just sit down and take a break? And so it's really great to have an opportunity to share this time with her and the knowledge around a topic, again, that's so incredibly important today on worker burnout. So before we get started around some practical action items, some tips around what you can personally do, what you can do as an organization, we wanted to set the context a little bit. And I know that probably just about everyone is fed up of hearing about COVID, looking at any statistics, but it was almost impossible to start this presentation without mentioning it at least a bit, because it just had such a profound impact on our lives. And you'll see later that it's not what created burnout. It's not where burnout originated. But I think for most of us globally, it has just pushed us beyond any limit that we could have ever imagined. It's happened globally, but it's happened in such different waves, in such different levels. I think if you look at the number of cases, you look at the number of distribution of vaccines, how it's impacting people individually, how it's impacting organizations. It's incredible. And it's very different depending on where you're living today. So how we're handling it has just an incredible impact, again, both on us personally and professionally. What else did COVID do? It put many countries into recession. Now, I'm not a historian by any means, but I don't know if ever in recent history we've gone through without at least some countries being in recession. Whether it was, countries in the United States, countries in Europe, Latin America, you look across the world and the economies go up and down. This might be one of the only times where we've been impacted so profoundly globally, where it's not even to say, we're experiencing it in the US, but at least other parts of the world are better at the moment and we'll ride this out. All of a sudden you look around and it's really hard to help each other from a country standpoint because we're all experiencing it at the same time. And so what did that do to the workplace? It created some of the worst unemployment rates in over a decade. Now we're getting some good news, some mixed news on unemployment numbers, on job creation. But overall, I would say in the recent months, maybe there's a little more optimism, at least in the US, but we're not out of the woods yet. And there's been such a huge and profound impact on professionals, on people's well-being, both physical, mental well-being. There's been a huge impact on working women to the point that this pandemic was dubbed also the first female recession. And so all of a sudden you have this just huge wave again across the globe of people losing their jobs and thinking, when will I be able to go into the workforce and when will I be able to compensate? So that, just looking at that context and saying, some days we probably wake up and say, okay, the sun is shining, it's one silver lining. There's always good things, but I think it's also really important for us to take a step back, really think about what's happening globally, and also understand that probably all of us are experiencing this situation in at least a slightly different way. That some people, are just pulling up and saying, I've got to get through this and I'm going to fight all the way through it. And other people are just saying, I'm just so tired. And I can't do this anymore. When is this going to stop? And there's really a place for all of it. And so how do we continue to go through it? Because I would say probably if you heard me speak last year, or if we talked personally, I was probably one of the very optimistic people, 2021, we've got this, and New Year's, we're ringing it in and it's going to be amazing. Now it's like, wait a minute, it's May. When is it going to end? When are things going to get better? So this is a big part of the reason why Andrea and I wanted to talk about this topic today, because it is something that's having such an incredible impact today. But again, burnout was not brought on by the pandemic. It's a phenomenon that's been around long before that. But one of the things that we can certainly do today, and we want to do, is make sure to raise awareness of it, because unfortunately it will not go away with the pandemic either. So what can we as individuals and what can we as organizations do to better support people as they go through burnout? And better yet, what do we do to actually alleviate it? What do we do to try to remove it as much as possible?
Thanks, Sanja. And just thanks so much for the opportunity to be here with you and get to do this presentation and have this conversation about burnout, which as a person who oversees a lot of cultural work at Aon, I can say is very near and dear to my heart. So thank you for the context that you gave around the situation. And although I know we focused a lot in those first couple slides on the aspect of the pandemic, I think it goes without saying that in addition to pandemic, we've had a lot of societal and, society unrest and political atmosphere that's been very high tension, that's just led and magnified a lot of these things that I think has been a year unlike many others, or any other, I could even say. But what is it when we talk about burnout? What is it exactly that we mean? And so you can see here that originally this concept sort of came about in the 70s, and it was defined as this idea of a syndrome that was resulting from chronic workplace stress that's not successfully been managed. And the interesting aspect of it is you can, if there was a trend line here, you would see this idea or this belief of people who have burnout slowly increasing from the 70s up until 2019, when the World Health Organization actually changed the classification of it to just this idea of a syndrome to actually a disease. And so it is something that we're seeing globally is continuing to be a trend in the upward direction as far as how people are feeling and this idea about being burned out from their workplace. So when we talk about then what is the impact that it has had personally on people, an HBR, Harvard Business Review study, asked individuals sort of what some of this burnout has been on their impact personally. And you can see 89% of people said their work life was getting worse. 85% said their well-being has declined. 25% said their family connection is impossible to keep strong. And 56% said their job demand has increased. And I think it's interesting that job demand has increased because Sanja, a couple slides ago, talked about the unemployment numbers and those unemployment numbers increasing. And so for those that were in many instances lucky enough to keep their job, what that often meant was they took on more responsibility because there maybe were less people to do the work that honestly in many instances may not have changed. But just again, companies trying to keep their impact and their revenue at some sort of stability was important. And so as I'm alluding to here, what does that mean from a business impact standpoint? And so when we think about this idea of burnout, that has led to $1 trillion of global loss in productivity per year for individuals or colleagues, as we call them at Aon, who've gotten this worker burnout, an equivalent of 550 million workdays being lost due to stress on the job. And that's just in the US. So that number is representative only the US, not even a global number. And then finally, 2.6 times is likely to be actively seeking a different job for those who are experiencing burnout. And so in that previous slide, when I talked about that 56% of people whose job demand has increased, oftentimes that may be some of your high performers or those key potential people you're wanting to retain that you've kept on the, in their jobs. And now those people, especially as Sanja alluded to, maybe we're getting slight semblances of in some parts of the world starting to come out of that pandemic, recognizing that in other parts of the world, they're still very much in it. Those high potentials, those high performers are 2.6 times more likely to start looking for jobs because of this experience they're having of worker burnout and this disease and this issue they're having of worker burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple of things to build off what you were saying, Andrea, is if we look at the previous slide quickly, I think, it's one of the things I remember when the pandemic started is as I was going through the house and it was chaos and I was thinking I have a toddler who had just learned how to walk and my parents were visiting. I live in Buenos Aires currently, and they live in Belgrade and Serbia across the world. And so they came to visit and they got stuck here. And I thought, how could it possibly get more chaotic? How do I organize my life? And then all of this research started to come out that those individuals who were living by themselves were impacted the most. And I mean, I would be lying if I didn't tell you, like every once in a while I daydreamed about what it would be like to be, sitting on the couch by myself watching Netflix with a glass of wine. Like, oh, how nice does that sound? Where the data came back and clearly showed me, no, these are the individuals that are impacted the most. They're suffering the greatest amount of depression, isolation. I thought, like, even when I talk about it now, it gives me goosebumps. Why? Because we look at the data and we have to understand that, again, we need to be so open-minded about what other people are going through, that we're impacted differently. And that this idea of burnout, every once in a while, you might hear somebody say, but everybody experiences stress. They do, but burnout is not stress. Burnout is getting to the point that you're so tired, you're just so stressed out by work that it's really getting difficult to function. So you'll hear this thread as we talk through. And like Andrea was saying with job search, this is something else that really, took me aback. And in both of our roles, Andrea and I work globally. And so we have this, pleasure of really having colleagues in all parts of the world and really understanding firsthand a lot of the different experiences. And so if you were here before our session when Tim popped on, when I saw this research, I actually jumped into our quick poll and I said, wait a minute, how many people are looking for jobs? What's going on? We're talking about so many people being so stressed out and feeling so lucky that they kept their job during the pandemic. And when I saw these numbers, I thought, really? And so I ran one of the quick polls, and what I found in that survey sample is that 75% of people said they were open to a new opportunity, and 42% were actively looking out of only employed people. So we just wanted to mention that because, again, I think in many cases, organizations did the best they could during the pandemic, and they try not to furlough people, they try not to lay off people. But it was hard, and there were really challenging things and tough decisions that needed to be made during that time. And so now is that time to really understand what are the people thinking? What are their workloads like? Are they manageable? What do they want in an employer? Because we just went through a year and a half almost of chaos. And the statistics we're seeing is that people are starting to look for something different, and they're starting to look outside of what they're currently used to or their current job. So what we wanted to jump to next is something else that's also been interesting when I've looked at this research is when we think about, combating burnout, we hear a lot around meditating and yoga and getting a lot of sleep, which are all amazing pieces of advice that I would highly recommend. However, what we also saw is that a lot of the root causes are actually not individual, but they're organizational. And so what Andrea and I will talk about next is what can individuals do to help themselves. But then if you're here and if you're somebody that's a leader in an organization, if you're somebody that's inside of an HR or people or culture or employee experience or any one of those departments, you can actually have a huge impact on your people's burnout. And this is how. So taking a step back, we wanted to take a look at what are some of the key causes of burnout. And by far, the top one was unsustainable workload. So again, going back to what Andrea was saying, that a lot of times the top performers were the ones that were worked the most. And we will keep saying that to make sure you hear us, because we know that they're so incredibly valuable. And then, they're usually the most conscientious parts of the team, and they're probably the ones whose productivity really skyrocketed. But it's just probably for many people getting impossible to manage what's going on. If they've been able to do it for the last year, at some point you reach a breaking point. So that's been the number one cause of burnout. And the second one is insufficient recognition effort. And so you'll hear this debated a lot when it comes to the hybrid workforce, when it comes to people working remotely. And a lot of times when you're in an office, if somebody did, something well, and Andrea and I are working together, for example, I can go by and be like, such a great job. And people around us will hear it. And, there's sometimes an organic way to show recognition, but now all of this becomes digital. And so for us, actually at QuestionPro, we ran a survey, back in January, and one of my colleagues, Evan, actually recommended a wins channel on Slack, because our employees were saying, I want to celebrate. It was about them partly, but it was also about celebrating their colleagues' successes and saying, I want to know when something really great happens. So we added a more general channel where we recognize all different kinds of efforts from all of our employees around the world. And it's probably, since I've joined QuestionPro in December, by far would have gotten the most notes about saying thanks to your team for implementing this, because it's such a great impact in our culture. The other few that we'll touch on, and then we'll get into some of the specific recommendations around the key causes of burnout. One is the perceived lack of control. So we'll talk around people's desire for flexibility in the work time, people's desire in the flexibility of the work location. Nothing you haven't heard about before, but just to, again, highlight the importance of really thinking about it in your organization. Lack of a supportive community. So that comes not only in the form of managers, but it comes in the form of colleagues. We talk a lot. There's so much more talk about now bringing your whole person to the office. And every once in a while I look around, and luckily my toddler is sleeping right now. But I always wonder, there's always this slight chance that he's just going to run in and want to be on screen. And that's a difference, in our reality today. And I feel like I've been so incredibly lucky that my colleagues are so supportive that that doesn't matter, that it's not judged. It's not something that would make me, be perceived as anybody that's contributing any less. And then perceived lack of fairness. And Andrea and I were chatting about this one a little bit from our Ph.D. training. And I bring up a concept of procedural justice a lot, and how people are given decisions, and this increased desire for transparency. And the findings that when people are given an outcome, they actually receive it a lot better if they understand why. How was that decision made, instead of just saying, hey, we couldn't give you a promotion, we couldn't give you a pay raise. People are a lot more upset than if somebody says, listen, our executives took a pay cut, the organization had, a tough year from a revenue standpoint. We really want to keep all of you. We're going to postpone this. We'll reevaluate in X number of months. So the exact same outcome can actually be perceived completely differently depending on how it's explained to the person. So now that we talked about what are some of the key causes, what can be done to actually help prevent burnout? So looking at manageable workloads, and we'll spend a few minutes talking about this because literally it was by far the biggest cause of burnout. Is the first one is that it's the most cited reason, not only for burnout, but decreased well-being. So if you think about mental, emotional, physical, oftentimes, because when we're burned out, it's not just about being tired, it's not just about being stressed out, but we can have physical impact. Your capacity and how much you're taking on is the number one thing that drives that. But also, actually, what I found quite surprising was, when does that happen? So for years, we've known about the finance and the banking industry and people putting in 80 plus hours, of work a week. And so when is a tipping point? And it's at 50 hours. So if you think about the most traditional work weeks are 40 hours, just over 50 hours, the risk of burnout increases significantly. So this is so important to think about when we think about the availability of our employees, when we think about the flex time and flex place that we talked about as we consider how do we move ahead with our working situation? What does the hybrid workforce look like? Do we really need to be conscious of when we're giving people flexibility, what does that look like? So all of a sudden it doesn't creep into, well, you can go out for lunch and take a few hours, but we really need you to be available all day, because that's very likely to impact the number of hours people worked. And again, not the first time you're hearing us, but that high performers have been overloaded the most.
Well, and one thing I'll add, Sanja, about that 50 hours that I think is really interesting in our current time is our commutes are gone. And so a lot of times for people where there was a little bit more sometimes time boxing, which we'll talk about a little bit more of our days, because we had to catch a train, or we wanted to beat the traffic, or we wanted to go to our children's or, some other sporting event or something, all of that sort of went away. And so we weren't commuting, there weren't trains we were transporting on, some of the sporting events weren't happening. And so what happened was our days became sort of unintentionally or unbeknownst to ourselves much longer. And then you think about those who work, like Sanja and I mentioned, in a global role, where sometimes if you're not careful, it kind of feels like you're working all day because somebody that you're working with is working all day long. And so very quickly, those 50 hours can just, come up just like that if you're not careful. And I think especially in our times where we're at home, at least for me, a lot of times in front of this screen and in this computer, 50 hours I'll hit 50 hours, maybe even by Wednesday, Thursday, if I'm not careful and thoughtful about my time.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, Andrea, an interesting thing, because actually, I think Crystal and I were chatting about it the other day, and just the idea of kind of thinking about different people's like lifestyles today. And so for me, sometimes I found it maybe easier being a mom, having that cutoff. Because let me tell you, the guilt I have around not spending enough time with my kid is huge. I watch and I'm like, oh, he's growing up during the pandemic, and is he developing okay? As I'm reading through all the developmental books and trying to figure out and not stress myself out, but then also stress myself out a little bit. And so to me, I think often it's almost, okay, you have a family, so you'll need to go make dinner and you'll need to, spend time with your kid. And I think what's really important for organizations to be thinking about too, is that for those who don't have kids, they don't deserve to be working any more than we do, that have these, really significant life commitments outside of work as well. And so that's where I think as we set up work, both for people who maybe don't have kids, because if you think about the trade-off and, do I go run in a park, or do I do a yoga class? Or what if I answer a few more emails? It might be easier to kind of make that trade-off and answer the emails, because you feel like you're not committing your time to somebody else or a human you brought in, into this world, but you're going to still have the same risk of suffering burnout. This is not sliced based on what your life situation is. This is everybody. So to me, it was kind of like that, also reversed, of making sure that everybody feels that same right to take the time for themselves and not say, okay, I have these extra few hours, I feel like I'm obligated to spend it on work. Great point. And then a few more just tips. One, communicate more often and more effectively about goals and priorities. So, one of our things in our PhD training, I remember, is when we had motivation class and we talked about goal setting. And I thought, we talked about SMART goals, and I thought, what a no-brainer. Of course, you're going to have specific goals and they should be manageable, and they should be challenging. And of course, organizations do that. And then I went into the real world and they don't. A lot of companies just don't. And it's not because of any ill intentions. It's because a lot of times we get wrapped up in what we're doing day to day, and maybe it's not so easy to define, but we have to do that. I think now more than ever, really being clear with what somebody's goal is, how to achieve it, and then also understand if there's not a capacity to do it is really important. And that's where we can borrow some of the agile approaches. And I always kind of giggle when I talk about agile, because I remember being at a conference a few years ago in London, and David Green, who was the keynote speaker, going on stage and saying that probably the only more overused word in HR at the time, aside from AI, was agile. I'm like, no, I'm doing it. But I think there's some good principles to be followed. So One is for teams or individuals to focus on fewer but more critical activities. So there's so many different things that we could be testing out. There's so many, let's try one thing, let's try another, which could be great, but oftentimes it can really be distracting, because what we don't do often enough is take something away. When we pile something on, you just pile and pile and pile. And I remember that when Andrea and I used to work together, we had this team and we had all these things we wanted to accomplish. And I think that's actually something we did pretty well, because her and I always, thought about like, what is our vision and what do we want to do and how do we get there? And, as colleagues, we kept each other pretty honest around like, can we do? Okay, no, like we can't. All right, let's take a look. What's the least important thing and cut it out? But a lot of times that doesn't happen. And you just end up, maybe starting your quarter with 3, big goals, and you end up with 7 or 8 or 10. Like, of course we couldn't finish that, because when we first thought about it, we decided on 3 and all of a sudden it grew. So that's where setting and resetting priorities is really important. So when you have ongoing meetings with your leader, it really gives you an opportunity to say, hey, this is what I'm working on. This is how I'm progressing. This is what we wanted to do by the end of the quarter. But like, you just asked me to do like 2 more things in the last month. Like, there's no way. Let's take a step back and let's see what is the most important. What's the most critical thing for us to get done? And of course, if I have enough time or if I'm making progress faster, we'll add. But if we're going to look at the end of the quarter, what's the most important thing for me to have done? And then it won't be a debate. And then if we can get anything else done, great. Which also in turn keeps you focused on the most important priorities, because there could be a lot of things that are critical, but we only have so many hours in the day. And so we have to really think about, what do we put those hours towards and what do we want to move most effectively? And also time boxing time boxing goals is really critical. So a lot of times I would recommend, for most of us, we'll have like an annual goal, but a lot can happen in a year. And I feel like, I don't know, over time, maybe it's just because I'm getting older, more can happen in a year. But it seems like a kind of a big chunk of time to manage. So what I would always recommend is really setting quarterly goals with an annual vision, an annual plan in mind. But really, quarterly is sometimes easier to manage. It's easier to have targets around it. It's easier to adjust. And then you see how you're progressing towards the annual ones, but it's good to have that firm check-in. And then the last one in this set is, of course, there are like a million recommendations, but we challenged ourselves to narrow it down to fewer, hopefully manageable ones, is making sure employees are comfortable speaking up when they're over capacity and asking to help review those priorities. So I mentioned that, Andrea and I, even when we were younger, were able to manage to do that effectively, but not everybody is comfortable to speak up. Not everybody, and especially remember, given our current context that we're in, for so many people, where we saw data that productivity increased during the pandemic. Why? Maybe partly because we're at home, but partly because we were so panicked we're going to lose our jobs. Of course, you're, just going to work so hard because you want to keep it. Is that, sustainable? Probably not oftentimes. But do you want to be the person to raise your hand and say like, oh, I can't do it anymore? You want to build a culture that's going to go towards that, but please don't assume you have that culture today, because it's difficult for people, even in the best of cultures, to do that. So while you work towards it, encourage your leaders to have those conversations in one-on-one, ask it in a more global scale, because again, work amount capacity has such a profound impact, not only on performance, but of course on a person's well-being, that until you feel pretty confident, and you should measure that, you have the culture where people feel comfortable raising their hand. Remember that oftentimes it's not human nature to do that. And to do the right by your people, to do the right by your organization, it's great to do it proactively, because you'll have the right data to be able to adjust where you need to adjust, without really counting on, people feeling fully comfortable to speak up themselves.
Yeah. And, what I would say is, especially on that last point there around essentially like, how do you create a culture where people are comfortable? I think a lot of what we're talking about today is this idea of, and you mentioned this earlier, is like, it's an organizational problem. Individuals make up that organization. And so although there should be things that we think about from an individual standpoint, you mentioned yoga, maybe it's running, meditation, et cetera. It's really all about how do we create a culture that empowers our employees and our colleagues to either own aspects of their own work structure, whether it's time, place, how they do it, or how do we also create a culture where speaking up and talking about prioritization is really, really key. And so when we look to the next slide, although I want to caveat that it says individual, this is not an intent to say these are things that only individuals should do, but this is really more about how do we empower those individuals and create this culture of empowerment where individuals feel that they can have control over things that are going to help mitigate burnout for themselves. And so some of the things that we've seen a lot, and we call it, and I'll reference it a couple of times at Aon, we call it the new better. And so we've evolved as we've, had to evolve in this virtual environment. What does that new better look like for us? And so we've done a lot with our leaders and our colleagues to really understand how do we thrive in this environment. And so some of the things we've talked about with them as far as success factors is how do we structure our calendar? How do we have dedicated breaks and personal time? And Sanja mentioned it many times, the clear definition of objectives and deliverables. And so this idea here is how do you actually empower your colleagues to really own some of these things, to structure their calendar in a way that makes sense for them, to allow themselves breaks and personal time where they need to continually have a clear definition of objectives and be okay reiterating those when the prioritization may have changed. What are some pitfalls? Inefficient work and waste of time. So when oftentimes what happens is we get sort of stuck in maybe the rut of email catching up, or it's hard for us to dig in deep to something and we're not really sure how to manage our time appropriately because we've got so much going on, it becomes overwhelming. So that can be a pitfall. Missing alignment and progress updates. So when we're not clear on how we should align moving forward or what the things we need to do. And then this has been obviously a bigger issue as of late, but this isolation of colleagues that work independently. So, in all of our organizations, we've got individuals who manage large teams, who work maybe on project teams that are very large. And we have a lot of people who are individual contributors and do a lot of work more independently. And so in a situation now where a lot of those colleagues who may have been in the office, but being an individual contributor are now at home and being an individual contributor, oftentimes that isolation can become a lot and can magnify burnout quite a bit. And so this good to know from APA, the American Psychological Association, workers who have control over their schedules report finding time to exercise more, eat better, and have higher morale and a better outlook. And so this idea that how can we give them and empower them to take more control over their schedules, knowing that they're still going to get the work done as long as we can help them as an organization and as leaders and managers of those individuals prioritize their time. And so what would that look like if, for example, and I'm not going to call out all of these, but here's how it could come to life in how individuals could use their calendars to their benefit. So how do you schedule dedicated heads down time? So time where you're going to be not interrupted. You turn off your email because, man, those email notifications really distract me, or those internal chats that people constantly do, which I also had to put mine on do not disturb for this time, or else I'd be horribly distracted. But give yourself dedicated heads down time to know that you're going to spend time focusing, going deep on some of those big initiatives, those critical things that the emails and the team chats and all of that gets a little bit in the way. An end of the day recap email, oftentimes for me, when I'm working on something large, that's super helpful. Even if I don't actually send it to anyone, but it's something that I use to help me recap and think about, okay, what did I get done for this project? What do I need to work on next? What's still outstanding? And then a clear work ending time, which, Sanja alluded to is in some instances, depending on the lifestyles that we have, is easier than others. I try really hard to end my day every day at 4:30 because I get from about 4:30 to 7:30 with my kids. And because of school and all these other things, and my days usually start really early. And so trying to hold myself accountable to that. On the weekly side, things about all day open virtual team room. This is something that I've seen be really, really effective in organizations. And so if there's a project team or even just a team, a team of like manager and peers and colleagues, having a sort of a virtual room, a Teams chat or something that's open all day that people just pop questions in, where they can get their questions answered real time, but it's not so disruptive that you need to have meeting after meeting after meeting, but it's a more agile, to use that term, Sanja, agile way of getting some real time information and access. Virtual coffee chats, where we used to take moments to go down, grab coffee, grab lunch, all of that in person to take a break. How are making sure you're incorporating those virtual coffee chats. And then finally, the last one, which I think is so important to mention, is some sort of social activity, which in the last, year has been really challenging for people to think about what sort of social activities could we have, dinners, sports, et cetera. But again, as a lot of the world, not all of the world, unfortunately, is slowly starting to come out of this pandemic, making sure that you're blocking off some time to do those social activities and putting them on your calendar, because that actually helps to hold you accountable for those. So if we look at the next slide, I thought this study was really, really interesting. A study done by the Boston Consulting Group that really looked at employee sentiment during COVID. And specifically what they asked for was people's desire about flexibility in where they worked and flexibility and when they worked. And I think the most interesting part about this is if you sort of add the blue boxes together, that ends up being 60% of respondents said that they want flexibility along at least one dimension. So either in where they work or when they work, but 40% of that 60% actually said they want some flexibility in both of those aspects. And so this idea about people wanting to feel like they can determine and dictate and have a bit more control over some of aspects of their work habits, whether that's the time frame they work in, the location they work, how they're working, that really helps to mitigate that burnout that's happening, because you're really empowering your colleagues to own that. And so thinking about this idea that 60% are asking for that from this study that happened during the COVID time, I think can be very telling. So how do we think about this reassessment of our boundaries? How do we think about, as an organization, what are things that we can help empower our colleagues to do that's going to help them feel more controlled around some aspects of their schedule and give them this idea of boundaries and what that looks like? So some success factors that we've seen. So designated organized work environment. And this is something that I think is a little bit tactical, but it's so important, is how do we ensure that where people have space that is actually sort of the designated workspace. I know so many of us, because of our living situations or circumstances, such as my husband, having to do workspace and working from the bedroom. And we've switched a couple of times just to mix that up and try and make sure that we both feel like we can have space that is our own, whether it's the office or different things, but getting a desk instead of working off a table, getting the right chair, things like that really do help to give you some sort of boundaries and control over things that are manageable. Minimizing distractions, but trying to give yourself dedicated breaks and a clear distinction between work and private life, which admittedly is something I'm still struggling with in this environment, is how do I find myself making sure that I spend some nights not working and actually doing something enjoyable, whether it's reading, watching useless television, or, doing a Zoom chat happy hour, usually with friends of mine. Potential pitfalls when you don't have all the right tools or work equipment, when there's reduced productivity through distraction. So you're easily getting distracted because of emails, because of certain things. Maybe it's because many of us have our children at home while we're working, and that can be a constant distraction. And the risk of burnout through missing boundaries. And so that burnout risk increases when we don't set boundaries, or we continually miss those boundaries or just blow right through them. And then I love calling this quota is like effective time management is closely correlated with a productive environment. And so the more that you can maximize the productivity in the environments in which we work, whether it's in the office or at home or at our vacation homes or at a different location, because I know so many people have relocated during this time, that's going to help with your time management, so much so.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I was thinking through as you were talking about all these points, and I was thinking about a friend that I had that said, when you move houses, if you don't hang your paintings like right away, they're not getting done. Like if there's anything extra and it doesn't happen like during like the honeymoon period of a new place, like forget it. They're probably sitting in the basement, sitting in the storage room. Like it's not going to happen. I was like, oh, she's right. Because like I still have unpacked boxes and I've been in this place for like 3 years. So tying that back to this is so many of us have been in our work situation for a long time now, like this, shift to working from home and, whatever desk you're working on or whatever chair you have. And it's the moment of like reset. And that's something else that we messaged out at, at QuestionPro earlier this year. It's like, hey, like, I think Vivek said, like, you shouldn't be sitting on a bench. Like, if you need our help to get a comfortable chair, like, let us know. So it's one, organizational support, but also the person themselves thinking like, am I comfortable? Like taking that moment instead of just, you kind of fall in a routine. You don't even realize, like, oh, my back really hurts. So the other day I sent my mom a photo of a new coffee mug that I got. And when that coffee mug made me so happy because it's on my desk, it's something new, but it's those little things to just make sure that every once in a while, like we reset ourselves, we think about our situation, we think about, hey, am I comfortable enough? Is there something else that I could add? Do I need, better Wi-Fi? Do I need a better mouse? Like, I think that's important because otherwise it's like many other things in life, we can fall into a routine and not realize that there could be something that's maybe not even substantial, but could make us significantly more comfortable. So yeah. I love these.
Yeah. Well, and finally, before I pass it back to you, Sanja, the last thing I'll just mention is this idea of, and this is really, again, sort of how this could come to life as we think about various options. And this isn't to say that like all of these are not possible, probably in most of our current situations with, kids, animals, significant others, nannies, everybody coming in and out, things like that happening, like life does get in the way, but just trying to identify, and these are some suggestions of things that we could, a few things, 1 or 2 things that we could do as individuals, but also that as an organization, we could give our colleagues the ability to make some of these decisions for themselves. And so some that I like to highlight is get up and get going as if you were preparing to leave for the office. So I joked with Sanja when we were talking about this, is that this has been my 2021 goal. Like by the end of 2020, I joked with, and there are probably a few AN people who've heard this joke, like I had fallen off the bus and been run over like a few times because I was like, no makeup, not doing my hair, like probably wore pants with no buttons for way too long. And so told myself at the beginning of 2021, I needed to pick myself up by my bootstraps and start to like pretend I was going to the office. And so every day I get up and I get dressed, I put pants with a buckle on it. I put on more work attire. I do my hair. I probably don't wear makeup every day, but I do have it on for you all today. But I feel like it's just something for me that just helps me get those boundaries. And then at the end of the day, I kind of change back into my lounge clothes. And that is sort of a closure for me for the end of my day. And that's something that has helped me give some boundaries and some semblance to what a day should look like for me. We talked about the one at the bottom, develop guardrails to keep working and private life separate. What are those guardrails? Is it a calendar reminder that says it's 4:30, it's time to be done? Is it that you're going to take your kids to school at 8 a.m.? Is it that you have to pick your dog up from doggy daycare by 5 o'clock? Whatever it is, keeping those separate and making sure that you've got guardrails that you're willing to hold yourself to. And then the other one I like to call out is choose a place that's designated for work and not used in breaks. And so I think it's really easy oftentimes for many of us who may sit, for example, I'll use my husband who works in the bedroom. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've walked in there and I found him like sleeping on the bed. And I'm like, are we working or are we sleeping? And so how do we find those opportunities to try and make sure that, like, if he is going to work in the bedroom, that there's clear sort of opportunities where he's not sort of finding himself getting overly tired. And we've talked about maybe you should move to the basement. There's a little less opportunity because sometimes it's hard to keep those lines. And again, not all of this is possible because many of us live in different spaces and have different lifestyles. But I think it's important to think about what works for you. And again, what freedom and flexibility as an organization are you able to give your colleagues to make some of these decisions about, the when, the where, the how of their working. So to mitigate this risk. So Sanja, back to you.
Yeah. No, and I love what you keep saying that, you've given this caveat a lot is what works for you. And I couldn't agree with that more because people have different styles. People have different preferences. Some things that would maybe drive me crazy, you would be okay with and vice versa. So it's really us understanding. Like I remember when we looked at one of the lists as we were doing our research of all the, things you could do to keep yourself feeling well during the pandemic. I mean, both Andrea and I are here, we're smiling, we're doing, we're hanging in there. But I looked at this list and I thought, it's shocking that I'm alive. Like, I'm not, following most of this. Like I couldn't. And it's because nobody can, we're all human, is just to say, hey, I need sleep and I'm a different human when I don't get it. So if I can, that's important to me. I should drink more water. I don't make it every day. I've tried to drink, green tea in the afternoon, but again, it's a personal thing. So a lot of this is really understanding like what has the biggest impact on you? How can you support your teams the most? And then focusing on that, not necessarily thinking about, if I have this, checklist of 20, 30 things, and if I get through all of them, life's going to be good because probably something else will come up anyways. And so that brings us to the next point of empathy. And this concept, again, not new. It didn't come with the pandemic, but I think probably if you look at like Google keywords or traffic, it's probably been just talked about much more in the last year or so than ever before. And I think, again, for good reasons, because we were jolted all into different realities, experiencing this catastrophe in different ways. And I know, when I've started to learn more about the concept of empathy and really, seeing the world through somebody else's eyes, I reflected back, and I think I'm generally a nice person, and I, try to connect well with others. But I found myself in the past judging people like, I can't believe he would do that, or I can't believe she would do that. And then some years would pass and, oh, wait, nope, I did the same thing that, one day I said, I couldn't believe a person would do, or like, why are they so upset about that? And so I felt, okay, with experience came wisdom. And so I started studying more about this. And empathy is hard because as humans, it's really difficult to try to understand what somebody else is going through if we've never experienced it ourselves. But guess what? That is life. And probably for better in many ways, we are going to go through life not having experienced a lot of the challenges that those that we care about and love in our lives are, but it doesn't mean that we can't find a way to be more understanding about it. So this is not, a whole hour about empathy, but again, as we navigate these very tricky waters, and as we continue to do that in the future, we thought it was really important to discuss it. Partly, we also have a statistic here that says 50%. So half of the employees say they don't feel like they can openly discuss mental health at work. And if you think back to what Andrea said before, burnout is a mental health issue. It is not being stressed out. It's a really, really significant burden that a person goes through. And so how do we, practice empathy? How do we become more empathetic? It's really engaging in deep conversations with somebody, understanding what their reality is. Identifying your own personal biases. So I showed some vulnerability and I admitted, maybe not to the specific situations, but to the fact that I've gone through that. And it was really eye-opening to say, wow, it's important not to judge others. It's important to really have that conversation and understand where they're going through really listening, through asking more questions, through being really that in the moment. And I was chatting with Crystal recently too, that actually in middle school, I had an advice column. Middle school, I don't know what I was doing having an advice column, but it was in the student newspaper, and I always wanted to help people. And the interesting thing with empathy is that it's not to fix someone, it's to understand where they're coming through, to be able to support them, Again, if you haven't personally felt something, to still be able to put yourself in a place where you understand where they're coming from. And in all of this, really being able to understand how can you create a more accommodating work environment for them, whether you're somebody's leader, whether you're somebody's colleague, there's a huge opportunity for empathy, no matter how you fit inside the organization. And here, if you go on YouTube and you look at Brene Brown and empathy, you'll find this video. It's amazing. It's such a good illustration. I've watched it more times than I can probably count on how to be empathetic towards others. So it's not necessarily something that happens overnight, but it's definitely a muscle that we keep wanting to try to use because it can have such a profound impact on our relationships and on the organization. So to start to close things out before Q&A, we wanted to share just a few examples on how Aon and QuestionPro help mitigate burnout. And one of the things, here in very practical terms, we actually included some survey item measures. Why? Because we've been saying throughout our presentation how important it is to have that conversation. It's important to have it on an individual level between managers, between colleagues, and it's really important to have it on the organizational level, because a lot of times the greatest change will happen when you look at the data and you say, wow, I really was not aware that this was happening in our organization. I wasn't aware that it was happening to this extent, or I wasn't aware that women were impacted in this kind of way. I've seen it have such incredible impact on those in the organization who can make the biggest difference, who can make the fastest decisions, who can find the budgets. That's why I would not understate the importance of doing that. It does not substitute authentic leader conversations, manager conversations, but it is a really, really powerful tool for change. Now, there are also two different things to look at. One is company effort and one is individual impact. And what's the difference? Here are some examples of the company items. So for example, saying, QuestionPro or Aon is genuinely interested in my health and well-being. I can openly discuss mental health at my organization. Our culture encourages balance. So it's all the way from how your organization, the efforts they're making, how it's perceived. Does the organization care? Does my manager care? Did they put technologies in place to help? So it's effort. And then there's impact. So I don't know about you, but I've had times in my life, personal, professional, where I would set out and then I would have a plan. All right, I'm going to get in shape and I'm going to do yoga and I'm going to eat certain kind of food. And 2 months later, well, nope, does not look, I need to change plan. So my intentions were good, but the plan that I built was not the right one for me. The same can go for the organization. So for what we're just saying, like my organization cares about me, my manager cares about me, but what they're doing, is it allowing me to balance my home and work life, which Andrea and I have mentioned a number of times how important that is, shut off from work. So my company cares about me and my well-being, but they don't maybe understand that I need to shut off, that maybe if my leader is messaging in a certain time, I feel the need. So how do I snooze the Slack? How do we stop emails at certain hours? That I'm able to take time off when I feel the need to recharge. So look at these two items. And let's go back to capacity and managing workloads. If you're committed, if you're really committed, and if you're a high performer, it is going to be really, really difficult for you to take a week off and sit on the beach and sip on your pina colada or whatever you want to sip on if you feel like you're falling behind in deadlines. So in order for you to really be able to unplug, to really balance, there has to be that notion of, I'm going to take a week off and it's not going to throw me off my targets. I will come back and I have a team that I know is moving things ahead. And I built this in because I knew when I was thinking about my quarterly goals that I have to find some time to rest. And if I don't, I need to go back to my leader. But if you have this anxiety, then I won't even go down the path of workationing that I read about recently, but don't. We need to have that balance. So anyways, there are a number of items here. And again, the idea is to be mindful when you're asking your employees around the efforts and the perceived care versus also how it's being received and it's impactful. Because as we iterate, as we realize that different people, based on how they involve in work, based on their lifestyle outside of work, things are going to have a different kind of impact. we could have the world's best intentions as organizations, but they just might not be hitting the most critical needs of our employees. But how great is it to have the data to know that, to be able to course correct and adjust, to make sure to match up that my company cares about me. And yes, I'm able to balance. And, no, I don't feel burned out from my work. And yes, I do receive recognition, etc.
Well, and this is to kind of finally close us out, and then we'll go to some Q&A, is, when I think about some of the things from AN, and I know QuestionPro does this as well, as Sanja mentioned, continually surveying, or what we call pulsing employees. And some of those questions Sanja just talked through are right in line with what we've done at AN. It's important to continually have a pulse check. I think we've surveyed sort of samples of our colleagues. We have an organization of about 50,000. We've done samples, I think, 4 times throughout the pandemic to just continually understand. Another thing that has happened is days off. So especially company-wide holidays. And so I think 2 or 3 times throughout this last year plus, we've been given company-wide holidays where the organization as a whole just shuts down entirely. And that's been really positive, because oftentimes if it's not the whole organization, to Sanja's point, she just make you come back and there's more emails than you've expected there to be on your day off, or you're working because people are emailing you on the days off you're trying to take. And so this idea of how do you actually give the whole a day, or it's been in many instances 2 or more days, where the whole company is able to just shut down for a couple of days. Expanding the learning curriculum to align to new ways of working. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is, how do we revamp all of our learning to be virtual, to be more adaptive to the environments that we're in? We talked about some of these things with new, better, that were the language we use at AON, but how are we able to meet people where they are, but still give them opportunities to develop and grow, but in a way that makes the virtual setting feel less onerous? Amplified visibility of recognition. Sanja mentioned that at the beginning, this idea that one of the reasons for burnout, big causes, is people feeling they're not being recognized in a way. And so how do we amplify that? How do we bring it up? And it really could be something as simple as, if you as a manager are going to send a note, CC your leader or the leader's leader on that email. How do we bring that visibility up to additional levels so that people can see it? We use Aon Stars is what we call them, where we can send people either e-cards or sometimes cards with some monetary amount to it. But just things like that you can do that's just going to amplify and bring up that recognition is so key. Leadership empowerment of team decision-making. I've talked about this a ton throughout. How do you empower your teams, the organization, your colleagues, your employees to be able to make more of their own decision-making for the things that they can? And then finally, continue to address additional challenges as they emerge. This idea of agility that Sanja referenced earlier. Things are constantly changing in this world right now, in this very volatile, sort of uncertain. We've got to make sure that we're continually able to address those challenges as they emerge and as they come up. And so with that, just say thank you. And then I guess we'll turn it over to see what questions we've had pop up.
Yeah, and we wanted to, I'll pop out of the presentation so you can see our faces a little bigger, but wanted to share our contact information, because again, I think you can tell that both Andrea and I are so passionate about this kind of work, and obviously collaborate between ourselves and our organizations, and have done so for many years. But also there's so much to be done. And I think both of us are very optimistic about what can come out and the changes that can be made. But it's going to take a village. It's going to take everybody really, coming together and pushing along. So this is our email addresses, our LinkedIn. Please feel free to connect with us. Send us a note if you have any questions for, what you could be doing personally or in your organization. If you have any ideas for how we can all change the world together, we're here. This is where you can find us. And with that, I will pop out of the presentation, and Crystal, you can take away the Q&A with the few minutes that we have left.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. We really value and appreciate you sharing all these nuggets of knowledge. We have a couple questions that overlap. So I'm going to, Heidi and Joshua asked, how can you kind of notice or sense when your employees are being at risk? Josh said he sees some of his employees on that path, but how do you approach them about it? And what should you do as an employer?
So I can mention a couple of things and then let Andrea jump in because I know she has a lot of good recommendations. So I think there's so many things, but a couple is one, when you're talking to, first of all, I would always encourage managers having ongoing one-on-ones with their employees. Again, building that culture of checking in proactively. Hey, how are you doing? How's your workload? Making it comfortable, also being vulnerable themselves. So there's a lot of leading by example. So if you as a leader are feeling, some kind of burnout or tension or like whatever, overwhelmed, if you're not, don't make it up. But if you are, just being able to say like, oh, I'm tired and I'm just really pushing through this, it allows through that example for the other person to open up. Asking is really great because people should be comfortable sharing that. There could be still people that are not. So it's like you kind of go through different parts of the spectrum. And then also, I would say if you think somebody is struggling, if you think their personality is just not one they would say, proactively recommend maybe say, you know what, maybe we just took on too much. We, not you. I think we maybe took on too much. Why don't we take a look at what you're working on? Hey, when's the last time you took a day off? So recommend instead of waiting for the person even to speak up. If you think that there is a threat while you build that closer relationship or closer culture of creating that openness, I think you can proactively really make a big difference. Andrea?
Yes. So the two things, one thing I'll reiterate, one thing to add, because I think you answered that really well. The one thing to reiterate is this idea of checking in. So we actually do a practice at AN that we call it check-ins. And it's a series of 3 questions that we ask when like meetings are starting. It's how am I feeling? Any interferences that are keeping me from being fully present. And then there's usually some sort of third question, which is usually like, what would success look like at the end of this meeting? Or if you were a weather meteorologist, how would you describe how, you're feeling with weather patterns or something like that? So there's a lot of different things you could toy with there. So we do that, and that's a useful way. And the one thing that I'll add that's a bit new is, if you have the power and feel empowered, maybe do like summer Fridays and give your whole team like the second half of the day off, or we do that a lot. Or if like you notice that the team's been working really hard, my boss is like, everybody sign off at noon today. Like, I don't want to see a single email. And so giving that, if you've got that freedom, take it and do that with your teams. It makes such a huge difference.
Yeah, the Heidi had a kind of a second part too, was you're doing this all virtually now, right? So is checking in on employees on the burnout road trajectory harder to do virtually than when you were in the office? And what are some helpful tips?
You want me to start with that one? Or
go ahead. And then I'll jump in because I'm like, I've heard about
So for sure it's harder because obviously in general, people have like bodily cues that are just harder to pick up in a virtual setting than if you were to see people in the office. So first and foremost, like it's definitely harder. Secondly, Sanja alluded to, like, if you're not doing regular one-on-ones with your colleagues, start doing those, because that is a great sense to be able to start to sense that even in the virtual environment.
Right.
But what I would say is that there should still be some cues and some tendencies even virtually that you can notice, because, for example, maybe people are portraying things in meetings where they're looking down more, or they're coming more and more frazzled. They're showing up late. They're less organized. These are signs of worker burnout. And so I think that some of those practices that we were just mentioning can 100% be incorporated in a virtual environment, but agree that if it's not something you're used to doing, start doing it now. And I think it's okay to say, like, I'm going to try something new with our team. And it may feel a little awkward at first, but we're going to keep doing it. And it's probably going to feel a little bit more normal after a while, but just bear with me. Like, go through this process with me. And I think that that's okay to make people know, like, yeah, it is really awkward, but we're going to keep doing it. So I'm going to lean into it. I think that's okay.
That's great.
Yeah. And just, again, totally agree with what Andrea is saying, and to build off of it a little bit, it's interesting because I was thinking about the burnout and the trajectory and like healthy eating and healthy habits. And in reality, like, we should be doing it all the time. Like I shouldn't start to feel like, fidgety or like I'm gaining like significant weight before I start eating healthier. It's like I should think about that before because it's important. Like I shouldn't only correct it when it gets bad. It should be the norm always. I know sometimes, perfect world versus reality, but it's good to build towards kind of that idea of we should have manageable workloads even before employees are burnt out, even if they can maybe hack it. We don't need to wait until then. And then of course, I guess being in the business that we're a big part of, why I joined QuestionPro is the idea of also being able to do these surveys and being able to give people confidentiality or anonymity that if they're saying, what, it's really hard for me to look you in the face and tell you that I'm feeling this way, getting them another place maybe where they would be more comfortable saying that. And so that's why it's not always a one size fits all solution, but saying if somebody is comfortable and I'm going to create that space in our one-on-ones or our team meetings, but it will also try a few different touch points. So that way I can get people in the different places where they're the most comfortable telling me today how they're feeling. Great. And yes, everything is hard virtually. We miss people. But we can do it.
There were a lot of really good questions. So I'm going to take them and we'll be doing it. We had a couple people ask if we would be distributing this. Yes, we are. And when we send out the emails, because I now have to go through and cut all the sessions from this giant Zoom meeting, we will send out also some of the more actionable follow-ups and just kind of give Sanja a plug. We did a hybrid workforce webinar about a month ago, and it's available on our website and on our YouTube channel, where we really gave away some actionable questions to ask your team and some like go-to things you should do. So make sure to check that out. And we just really appreciate all of your insights and the great content you brought us, guys. Thank you so much, Andrea, for spending the afternoon with us. Dan, come back.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And it was a wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Crystal.